بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب زدني علما.
Muslims who died upon Tawheed, but they had committed major sins, and so they ended up in the hellfire. They will not stay in the hellfire forever. Even though they did the major sins and they ended up in the hellfire, they did die upon Tawheed. So they don't stay in the hellfire forever. Sunnah do not declare the people of the Qibla, Muslims, to be non-Muslims because of sins, major sins that they may have done, like the Khawarij do. The Khawarij do declare them to be non-Muslims. But Ahlul Sunnah, we don't declare Muslims to have become kuffar because of sins that they've committed, even if they are major sins.
وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. So carrying on then with the explanation of Usool-Us-Sunnah of Al-Humaydi rahimahullah ta'ala, we got up to the final section of, or within the section regarding who we can testify to as being from the people of paradise. And we had said that regarding the statement لا يشهدون لأحد أنه في الجنة, that we do not testify to anybody specifically being in paradise. يريدون أن هذا هو القول في من مات من أهل التوحيد ولم يرد فيه نص بأنه من أهل الجنة وإن كان مآله إليها. This is regarding the people who died upon Tawheed, but there is no specific text telling us that this exact person is in paradise. Even though their end abode will be paradise, then we do not testify to that person being in paradise unless the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has mentioned people, believers by name. Then we of course testify that they are in paradise. For example, al-ashara al-mubashirina bil-jannah, the 10 who were given the glad tidings of paradise, and other than them too. Then after that, قال الإمام الحافظ أبو جعفر الطحاوي في عقيدته المشهورة. In Al-Aqeedah al-Tahawiyah of Al-Imaam Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi, he said, وَأَهْلُ الْكَبَائِرِ مِنْ أُمَّةِ مُحَمَّدٍ صلى الله عليه وسلم في النار لا يخلدون إذا ماتوا وهم موحدون وإن لم يكونوا تائبين بعد أن لقوا الله عارفين مؤمنين وهم في مشيئته وحكمه إن شاء غفر لهم وعفى عنهم بفضله كما ذكر في كتابه ويغفر ما دون ذلك لمن يشاء. that the Muslims who do major sins, who end up in the hellfire, will not stay there forever if they had died as people of Tawheed. Muslims who died upon Tawheed, but they had committed major sins, and so they ended up in the hellfire. They will not stay in the hellfire forever. Even though they did the major sins and they ended up in the hellfire, they did die upon Tawheed. So they don't stay in the hellfire forever. And that is even in the situation where they committed major sins, never sought repentance for them, never sought forgiveness for them, never made tawbah. So they may end up in the hellfire to be punished, but they will still not stay in there forever. So they will be under the will of Allah, تحت مشيئة الله, under the will of Allah, as some of the scholars they mention. If Allah wishes, He will just forgive them. As Allah said in the Qur'an, وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ, that Allah forgives all else besides shirk to whomsoever He wishes. وَإِنْ شَاءَ عَذَّبَهُمْ فِي النَّارِ بِعَدْلِهِ, and if Allah wishes, He may punish them in the fire by His justice. ثُمَّ يُخْرِجُهُمْ مِنْهَا بِرَحْمَتِهِ وَشَفَاعَةِ الشَّافِعِينَ مِنْ أَهْلِ طَاعَتِهِ, but then afterwards He will extract them from the fire, take them out of the fire by His mercy and by the intercession of those who intercede on that day from the obedient ones. ثُمَّ يَبْعَثُهُمْ إِلَى جَنَّتِهِ, so then after that, if they've been punished in the hellfire for sins that they did, but they died upon Tawheed, so then after that they are taken out of the fire, they don't stay there forever, and they are put into paradise. وَذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى تَوَلَّى أَهْلَ مَعْرِفَتِهِ وَلَمْ يَجْعَلْهُمْ في الدارين كأهل نكرته الذين خابوا من هدايته والذين نالوا من ولايته. اللهم يا ولي الإسلام وأهله ثبتنا على الإسلام حتى نلقاك به. انتهى كلامه. So then he says that if Allah wishes, He will punish them, but then take them out by His mercy and by the intercession of those who intercede on that day from the obedient ones, and then they'll be put into paradise. And that is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects those people who recognized Him, and Allah does not make them like the ones who rejected Him. The people of Tawheed obviously have a virtue over the people of Kufr. Even if that person of Tawheed did sins, major sins, they are not now going to be equaled and put on par with the mushrikeen, those who committed shirk. There's still a big difference between them. So the people of Tawheed are not going to be equaled with the people of shirk. The people of Tawheed, the people who were upon the guidance, if they committed sins, major sins, and so they end up in the hellfire for them, they won't stay in there forever because of that. They were people of Tawheed, so eventually they'll be taken out. So this is all, as you remember, a refutation of the Khawarij. The Khawarij, who do not believe this, the Khawarij, they claim that those people who committed the major sins in the afterlife, they are kuffar and they will stay in the hellfire forever. And that is false, as you can see from the scholars and their statements and the evidences. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah said, this is the next point. قال الإمام شيخ الإسلام ابن تيمية الحراني في كتابه العقيدة الواسطية, the famous book العقيدة الواسطية, ومن أصول أهل السنة والجماعة. He said, from the principles of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah is أن الدين والإيمان قول وعمل, قول القلب واللسان وعمل القلب واللسان والجوارح, that the religion and Iman is statements and actions. And what they mean by that is statements of the heart and the tongue, actions of the heart and the tongue and the limbs. Simplified by many scholars by saying belief in the heart, statements of the tongue, actions of the limbs. وأن الإيمان يزيد بالطاعة وينقص بالمعصية, and that Iman increases by obedience and decreases by sinning. Obedience to Allah is a means of strengthening Iman, is a means of fortifying that Iman, increasing that Iman. But the opposite, disobedience to Allah, that is of course a cause for the weakening of Iman. A person's Iman weakens when he commits sins. وَهُمْ مَعَ ذَلِكَ, but despite that, despite a Muslim weakening in his Iman and decreasing in his Iman when he commits sins, despite that, لا يكفرون أهل القبلة بمطلق المعاصي والكبائر كما يفعله الخوارج. Despite that, they do not, Ahlul Sunnah do not declare the people of the Qibla, Muslims, to be non-Muslims because of sins, major sins that they may have done, like the Khawarij do. The Khawarij do declare them to be non-Muslims. But Ahlul Sunnah, we don't declare Muslims to have become kuffar because of sins that they've committed, even if they are major sins. We don't declare them to be kuffar upon that. The Khawarij, that is their misguidance, they do that. بل الأخوة الإيمانية ثابتة مع المعاصي كما قال سبحانه. That brotherhood of Islam, that Iman remains. And you remember that example about the one who kills somebody, he murders someone, so he is a murderer, major sin. That doesn't make him a kafir. Because in the Qur'an it says, فَمَنْ عُفِيَ لَهُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٌ فَاتِّبَاعٌ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, that the one who is forgiven by his brother. So the murderer has killed a Muslim, that Muslim's brother is still the brother of the murderer, proving that the murderer is still considered a Muslim. Otherwise, why would Allah call that person the brother of the murderer? If the murderer has become a kafir by committing murder, then that person isn't his brother in Islam anymore. Allah said he is his brother, proving that the murderer is still a Muslim. He hasn't become a kafir by committing that sin. وذكر بعض الآيات في المقام ثم قال, and then Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned some ayahs, and then he said, ولا يسلبون الفاسق الملي الإسلام بالكلية. That Ahlul Sunnah, we do not strip away the iman of a sinner who is from Islam. A Muslim who commits sins, we don't strip him of his iman and say he's a kafir. وَلَا يُخَلِّدُونَهُ فِي النَّارِ. Neither do we declare him that he's going to be in the hellfire forever. كَمَا تَقُولُهُ الْمُعْتَزِلَةِ. Like the Mu'tazila do say that, and that is false. بَلِ الْفَاسِقِ الملي يدخل في اسم الإيمان المطلق. A Muslim who is a sinner is still within the overall fold of Iman. He is still within the overall fold of Iman. وقد لا يدخل في اسم الإيمان المطلق كما في قوله تعالى إنما المؤمنون الذين إذا ذكر الله وجلت قلوبهم وإذا تليت عليهم آياته زادتهم إيمانا وعلى ربهم يتوكلون. وقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يزني الزاني حين يزني وهو مؤمن ولا يسرق السارق حين يسرق وهو مؤمن ولا يشرب الخمر حين يشربها وهو مؤمن ولا ينتهب نهبة ذات شرف يرفع الناس إليه فيها أبصارهم حين ينتهبها وهو مؤمن. نقول هو مؤمن ناقص الإيمان أو مؤمن بإيمانه فاسق بكبيرته، فلا يعطى الاسم المطلق ولا يصلب مطلق الاسم بكبيرته. And that is the point after giving those examples about when the ayat of Allah are recited, it is only the believers whose hearts tremble and it increases them in Iman and they have their trust in Allah. And then the hadith about how a fornicator at the time of fornicating is not a believer, and the one who steals at the time of stealing is not a believer. And the evidences go on in that hadith. And then Shaykh al-Islam says at the end, what we say is that a person committing these sins, he is a mu'min with deficient iman. He's a mu'min with deficient iman. Or you can phrase it as saying he is a mu'min with his iman and he's a fasiq, a sinner because of that wrong he's doing. But what we don't say is that he's a kafir. So neither do you say he is complete and full and perfect with his iman, but neither do you say he's lost all of his iman. Rather we say he has some iman, but it is deficient clearly. That's why he's committing these major sins and other sins. He is deficient in his iman, not that he is absent in his iman. There is one other point to make. وهناك وجه آخر في هذا الإطلاق عند أئمة أهل السنة، وهو أنهم لا يكفرون من وقع في ذنب إلا إذا كان مستحلا، أما غير المستحل فلا يكفرونه، كما قرر هذا جمع من الأئمة كابن عبد البر وابن قدامة وابن تيمية وغيرهم. Something else which can be highlighted here is that there is one circumstance where if a person commits a sin, you would declare him to be a kafir. And we're not talking about shirk, we're talking about major sins. That is in the instance where a person commits some kind of sin, declaring it and believing it to be halal, i.e., he declares the Qur'an and the Hadith to be false in regards to that. He doesn't accept that this is a sin. He rejects the ayahs of the Qur'an declaring it a sin, rejects the Hadith declaring it to be a sin, and he declares it to be halal. That is kufr. That can be kufr. Because that now is a situation of a person rejecting the revelation and legislating his own legislation, declaring something to be halal that Allah has declared to be haram. So that's a different circumstance compared to most people who do a sin knowing that it's a sin. The one who drinks alcohol, you ask him, he'll say, yeah, of course, as a Muslim you're not supposed to, but he's doing it because he's a sinner. That's not a kafir then. But the one who does it and says, absolutely, there is no prohibition, forget that, it's wrong what the Qur'an, the Sunnah says, alcohol is halal. That's a different situation now. So that is the mustahil, the one who declares it to be halal. That's a different situation. But for the majority of the Muslims, when they commit sins, you ask them, they know it's wrong. They know it's wrong, it's haram, they're not supposed to, but they don't care, or they're just doing it, they are weak and they're following their desires. So that wouldn't be a kafir then. He knows it's wrong, but it's weakness of his iman is doing it. وقال العلامة أبو الحسن الأشعري في كتابه الإبانة والذي ألفه بعد رجوعه إلى عقيدة أهل السنة والحديث وانتسابه إلى الإمام أحمد Al-Imam Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari. Of course, he returned back from being Ash'ari and was from Ahl-Sunnah wal-Jama in the end. And he wrote the book Al-Ibana when he was upon the way of Ahl-Sunnah. And he said in that, وَنَرَى أَلَّا نُكَفِّرَ أَحَدًا مِّنْ أَهْلِ الْقِبْلَةِ بِذَنْبٍ يَرْتَكِبُهُ. And we see, our position is that we do not declare anyone from the Muslims to be a kafir because of a sin they commit. كالزنا والسرقة وشرب الخمر, like fornication or stealing or drinking alcohol. كما دانت بذلك الخوارج, unlike the Khawarij who take their religion upon doing exactly that, declaring them to be kuffar. The Khawarij declare people who do these kinds of sins as kuffar. That's their religion, that's their belief, that's their aqeedah. Us Ahl Sunnah no. وزعموا أنهم بذلك كافرون. ونقول إن من عمل كبيرة من الكبائر مثل الزنا والسرقة وما أشبهها مستحلا لها كان كافرا إذا كان غير معتقد لتحريمها. So the one who declares it to be halal, meaning in belief, in his heart, his aqeedah is that this isn't a sin, it's halal. That one then, yes, can be declared as a kafir. He is declared upon kufr if he believes in his heart it's halal and rejects the ayat and the ahadith saying it's haram. And in that case, if a person believes it to be halal and rejects the Qur'an and the Sunnah declaring it to be haram, then that person has committed kufr even if he doesn't even do the actual action. Even if he doesn't even do the actual action, if he has the aqeedah that it's halal and therefore rejects the Qur'an and the Sunnah that says it's haram, that's kufr already, regardless of whether he does it or not afterwards. Regardless of whether he does it or not, that aqeedah is an aqeedah of kufr, rejecting the Qur'an and the Sunnah and declaring this thing to be halal, whatever that sin may be. As for a person the other way around, in his heart he knows it's haram, but in his actions it's as though he thinks it's halal, he's doing it. That one isn't a kafir. In his heart he knows it's wrong, it's haram, but on his actions, following his desires and weakness in iman, he goes and does it. That's the difference to remember. And that's why when the Khawarij and the Ikhwanis and all these people, they declare the rulers to be kuffar, they say the Muslim rulers are kuffar, they say, look, they have interest in their banks in their countries, or they allow cinemas, or they allow this, or they allow that. These are all sins, major sins, that's kufr, then they are kuffar. We say no, because the difference is the belief in the heart and rejection of the rulings, or is it just a sin? You can't say that these rulers have declared those things to be halal and they reject the Qur'an and the Sunnah. The rulers are in the same position, from the weakness perhaps, other pressures, political pressures, economic, whatever it is, they've allowed certain things to pass, even though they know in the Qur'an and the Sunnah that isn't allowed. But they allow things to pass, allow things to happen. Then that's just like you and me. They've committed a sin. They haven't committed kufr. They've committed a sin. They haven't committed kufr. So you can't start declaring rulers to be kuffar because they've done some sin in their country. That isn't a proof that they believe it to be halal and that they are rejecting the Qur'an and the Sunnah in declaring it haram. They are just falling into a sin like anybody else who goes and does that sin on the street. وقال الإمام ابن القيم رحمه الله في إغاثة اللهفان فإن المستحل للشيء هو الذي يفعله معتقدا حله. So the mustahil is the one who does that sin believing in his aqeedah it's halal, and therefore rejecting the revelation declaring it to be haram. Also Ibn al-Qayyim, he said, أن المدعو إلى الإيمان إذا قال لا أصدق ولا أكذب ولا أحب ولا أبغض ولا أعبده ولا أعبد غيره كان كافرا بمجرد الترك والإعراض. That a person you give da'wah to, if he says, you know, all this what you're telling me, tawheed, religion, everything, neither do I believe it, but neither do I deny it. I don't believe, but I don't deny. I don't love it, I don't hate it. I don't worship Allah, but neither do I worship anyone else. If he takes that kind of position, he's a kafir. That is a position of kufr, because he has abandoned the correct aqeedah and turned away from it by saying, I don't worship Allah, but I don't worship anybody else either. I don't believe in what you're telling me, but I don't reject it either. That's a nonsensical position, that is kufr, until you believe. But as for the one who says, أنا أصدق الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم وأحبه وأؤمن به وأفعل ما أمرني ولكن شهوتي وإرادتي وطبعي حاكم علي لا تدعني أترك ما نهاني عنه. If a person says, my position is I believe in the messenger, I love him, I believe in him, have iman in him, and I do what he commands me to do. However, my desires do overwhelm me and they don't leave me alone, and I do end up falling into what I am prohibited from. وأنا أعلم أنه قد نهاني وكره لي فعل المنهي. And I know Allah has prohibited me from these actions and dislikes that I do these prohibitions. لكن لا صبر لي عنه, but I can't be patient, I end up falling into those sins. فهذا لا يعد كافرا بذلك. That person there is not a kafir in that case. He accepts he's doing wrong and haram. He knows it's haram. He doesn't believe it's halal. So he's a sinner, not a kafir. As opposed to the one who believes it's halal and is therefore rejecting the Qur'an and the Sunnah. Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen, he said, regarding somebody who asked him, how do we determine somebody who is declaring it to be halal? How can we work out who that person is and what is the criteria for that? He said, الاستحلال أن يعتقد الإنسان حل ما حرم الله. That basically a person believes something to be halal that Allah has declared as haram. وأما الاستحلال الفعلي فينظر لو أن الإنسان تعامل بالربا لا يعتقد أنه حلال لكنه يصر عليه فإنه لا يكفر لأنه لا يستحله، ولكن لو قال إن الربا حلال ويعني بذلك الربا الذي حرمه الله فإنه يكفر لأنه مكذب لله ورسوله. So he gives an example. Imagine a person takes interest in his bank accounts, he takes interest, or in loans and other business dealings, he takes interest, involves interest. If he knows it's haram, knows it's wrong, but he ends up doing it because of profit and whatever else, then that one isn't a kafir. But if he does so believing it's halal, you can take interest, and therefore he's rejecting the ayat in the Qur'an that are prohibiting it, ayat in the Qur'an and a hadith in the Sunnah, then that one is the one who has committed kufr. He's rejecting the revelation declaring to be halal what Allah has declared to be haram. That is kufr. But the one who knows it's haram but falls into it out of weakness, that one is not kufr, that is just a sin. Then Shaykh al-Bukhari says, أن من الأعمال, this is just an additional point of benefit, أن من الأعمال إن أتى بها العبد فإنه يكفر بهذا الفعل أو العمل. There are certain actions though. So now you've understood the principle how it works. But there are certain actions. There are certain actions. If performed, then they by default indicate you are declaring them to be halal. There are certain actions which by default it is considered as you declaring them to be halal. لأن إتيانه بها دليل على استحلاله قلبا. Because if a person does those specific actions, it is an evidence that by default he must consider them to be halal. For some actions that works. لا تصدر من قلب معظم لله ومحب له قائم بأمره جل وعلا. Because these, we're going to mention some examples, are certain types of sins that only a person who has no love in his heart, has no reverence in his heart for Allah would do. They are so despicable and terrible that the person who does them, you can automatically gauge that this person is declaring that to be halal. Because it's not the kind of sin you can do believing that, okay, I know it's wrong, I know it's a sin, but I'm going to do it. It's not like that. There are certain sins where that just doesn't work. The majority, yes. Somebody drinks alcohol, they know it's haram, but they do it. Somebody falls into fornication, the desires overtook them. Sins that occur, they know they're haram. But there are certain types, it just doesn't work for a person to say, I know it's haram, but I fell into it. It doesn't work. What kind of sins are they? An example of that would be what? Exactly. Insulting Allah or the Messenger is a prime example of that. If somebody insulted Allah, made some despicable speech against Allah, cursed Allah or the Messenger, that is simply not something you can say, I know it's wrong, but I'm going to do it. You know it's wrong, but you're going to curse or insult Allah and the Messenger. It doesn't work for you to say that I know it's wrong. That is kufr. That action is kufr. When a person does something like that, it is kufr. You can't say, I know it's haram, but I still did it. You know it's haram to insult Allah and the Messenger, but you still did it. That is too much. That is considered as istihlal, kufr, when you do that. Another example of that would be if somebody got a copy of the Qur'an, put it on the floor and stepped on it. If a Muslim did that, it is kufr. Kufr. The speech of Allah, the Qur'an. Somebody's going to say, I know it's haram, but I'm going to go do that. Do that, put it on the floor and then step on the Qur'an on purpose. That type of action is immediately kufr, because that is insult and mockery against Allah, against the ayat and the speech of Allah and the Messenger. And anybody who goes into mockery and insult against Allah, against the ayat of Allah, the Qur'an, against the Messenger, that is kufr. That doesn't come into this issue, but maybe he doesn't believe it's halal. You do something like that, you transgress the boundaries on those issues, but not on all of the other sins. This is the mistake the Khawarij make. They say that applies to all these other sins. If somebody allows interest in their banks in their country, that's such a big sin, he's transgressed, that has to be kufr. No. Interest and even fornication and stealing and alcohol, these are major sins. But they are not at the level of mocking or insulting Allah and the Messenger and the Qur'an. These are sins that are automatically kufr, not all of the others. Because the point is, with these actions, somebody who puts the Qur'an on the floor and steps on it, or swears at Allah or the Messenger, curses and insults and mocks Allah and the Messenger, nobody could do that. No Muslim could do that unless he has lost all of his iman. No Muslim with even a little bit of iman would insult Allah. And you know that. You go to the most common person on the street, the most jahil person, hasn't got a clue about the religion, but you say to him, curse Allah. What do you think about somebody who curses Allah? They'll say, astaghfirullah. The most common person on the street who doesn't know anything about Islam, never studied, maybe he doesn't barely even come to the mosque or anything, pray. But if you say to him, cursing Allah, the Qur'an, step on it on the floor, he'll say straight away, astaghfirullah. Even he knows. Every Muslim knows these things. No Muslim would do something like that unless his iman is completely gone. He's committed kufr. Whereas stealing, fornication even, murder even, doesn't necessitate you've lost all of your iman. That can happen to a person who's still a believer, but they are weak in their iman, and the shaitan overtook them and their desires overtook them. But what desire overtook you to step onto the Qur'an or to curse Allah? That is certainly the loss of iman. That is kufr. Ibn Qudama, he said, Man sabba Allah, whoever curses Allah, kafara, has committed kufr. Sawa'an kana mazihan aw jaddan, whether he's joking or serious, regardless. وَكَذَلِكَ مَنْ اسْتَهْزَأَ بِاللَّهِ, and likewise the person who mocks Allah. أَوْ بِآيَاتِهِ أَوْ بِرُسُلِهِ أَوْ كُتُبِهِ, or mocks the ayat of Allah, the Qur'an, or the messengers of Allah, or the books of Allah, then they have committed kufr. As Allah said, وَلَئِن سَأَلْتَهُمْ لَيَقُولُنَّ إِنَّمَا كُنَّا نَخُوضُ وَنَلْعَبُ قُلْ أَبِاللَّهِ وَآيَاتِهِ وَرَسُولِهِ كُنْتُمْ تَسْتَهْزِئُونَ. That if you ask them, they'll say, we were just joking and messing around. Say to them, with Allah and His ayat and His messenger, you were mocking and messing around? That is kufr. You have committed kufr after your iman. Also, Ibn al-Qayyim mentioned another example to make another point, which is that, so now we're starting to understand all of these principles one by one. with sins, overall with sins, if a person commits a sin but knows it's haram, then that isn't kufr. But if he commits the sin believing it's halal and therefore rejecting the Qur'an and the Sunnah, then it is kufr. Then the second point was, but there are certain sins that don't come into those principles, and that is mocking Allah and the Messenger and the ayat. They are automatically kufr. But then now the next point is, what if you end up doing those things because you were compelled or forced or out of complete ignorance and mistake? Then are you still deemed as having committed kufr? That's the point here now. What about then, firstly, if somebody does something like that within the arena or the realms of mockery of Allah or some ill statements against Allah, but does it completely unaware of what he's done, completely by mistake, no intention to do what he did, but he did it completely by mistake? Would that be kufr or not? Absolutely and completely by mistake. Kufr or not? No. It wouldn't be. And there's an example. And the example is تقدم أن الذي قال لما وجد راحلته اللهم أنت عبدي وأنا ربك أخطأ من شدة الفرح لم يكفر بذلك وإن أتى بصريح الكفر لكونه لم يرده. There's the hadith about the man who was in the desert and his camel disappeared. He was in the desert with his camel, with his water and his food and everything on the camel, his bags on the camel. He sat down for a moment or something and the camel walked off, and when he opened his eyes, the camel was gone. So now he was in the middle of the desert with no food, no water, no riding animal. He can't walk his way out of the desert far, too much of a distance. No water, no riding animal. He's stuck in the desert. He's going to die in the desert basically. So in the hadith it mentions, he knew there was no way out. He cannot walk out of the desert. He's got no water. He's got no camel. He sat down under a palm tree, closed his eyes, just waiting to die. There's no point even trying to carry on walking. He knows the desert. He knows the distance. He knows it's impossible to walk out of the desert to get to the nearest village or nearest source of water. He knows that already. So he just sits down waiting to die, knowing it's only death now. So he sits down, and it says in the hadith, after a while when he opens his eyes, by the decree of Allah, his camel is back. Wherever it had gone, it walked back to him and it's there. His camel is there, his water, his food, everything is there. He had sat down, closed his eyes, waiting to die. He was now resigned to death. Imagine the person's emotion now in the middle of the desert, waiting to die. Waiting to, the thirst to come in and to dehydrate and just to burn up in the sun and die. Then all of a sudden, from that mentality, completely finished waiting for death, you see the camel and you realize you're not going to die. He was so happy that he wanted to thank Allah. And so he said, "Oh Allah, you are my slave and I am your Lord." He actually meant to say, "Oh Allah, you are my Lord and I am your slave." But he was so overwhelmed with happiness, it just got mixed up in his head. And he just said it the wrong way around by complete accident. From his overwhelming happiness that he's going to live, he's not going to die. "Oh Allah, you are my slave and I am your Lord." He meant to say, "Oh Allah, you are my Lord and I am your slave." From happiness, overwhelmed by it, he just mixed up his words and said it the wrong way. His words are words of outright kufr. "Allah, you are my slave and I am your Lord." They are words of outright kufr. Yet this man in this hadith, is he declared a kafir for what he did? No. He had no intention of that. It was completely twisted in his tongue when he said it. Complete accident. No intention of that. Even though the words themselves that he did say are complete words of kufr. So that shows that in that kind of circumstance, it's not kufr. Also, the one who is compelled and forced, then it's not kufr either. Somebody comes with a gun and shoots you in the leg, shoots you in the other leg, shoots you in the arm, in the other arm, 4 bullets now in all of your limbs, and he points the gun at your head. He says the next bullet is going in your head unless you say some words of kufr. Unless you say some insult against Allah, some words of kufr, reject Islam, say something like that, or the next bullet, the 5th bullet, is in your head. So he's being serious. He's put 4 bullets in you already. Now the gun is pointed at your head, the next one's going into your head. Say the words of kufr, reject Islam. So now if the person says it, and the man lets him live then, doesn't put the bullet in his head and he survives, he did an action of kufr, but he did it under duress. Under duress, under compulsion. His heart was content upon Iman. He was saying words that were not coming from his heart. He was only saying those words, just saying them to get out of death. That again would not be considered kufr in that case. That is where we'll stop on for today then. And inshallah ta'ala we'll continue with the next section from that point next time. We're getting quite close to this book now, to the end of it. Maybe another 3 sessions possibly. I think we might finish the book inshallah ta'ala. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.